Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. So today is Easter Monday, and it's kind of a day where people should think about rebirth and rejuvenation and spring, and whether you're Jewish and celebrating Passover, or Muslim celebrating Ramadan, or Christian celebrating Easter, or agnostic and just hopefully celebrating the coming of spring. I thought it would be really good to connect in with Anita Nowak, who is a lecturer at McGill University in the business school, and has just issued and published a book on empathy, purposeful empathy, tapping our hidden superpower for personal, organizational, and social change. And I thought it would be really good to check in with her and find out, what empathy is all about, because I think it's probably one of those things that we need to have if we're going to create this world that all these different religions, all of us, and hopefully a lot of people that aren't religious think about at this time of the year. Anita, welcome to the show.
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me, Brian. And I just want to echo the sentiments around happy Ramadan, happy Passover, happy Easter. Hope the kids are having fun finding some eggs. I think we've never been at a moment in time in human history where the need for empathy has been greater. We're facing a lot of collective challenges, and I think we need to collaborate. It was interesting when I started doing research about empathy that I discovered people who study evolutionary science and how we evolved as a creature, as a species, some 40,000 years ago, there were other large-brained species wandering planet Earth with us, but we survived. We survived. And the reason for that, they say, has part to do with how we evolved physiologically. The whites of our eyes grew really big. We lost most of our facial hair, and our testosterone dropped relative to the other creatures. And they surmise that all happened because we needed to read each other's facial expressions and understand what we were trying to communicate to one another without necessarily having to use words. And so the baseline of how we survived and thrived is thanks to our capacity to empathize. And so that served us well as a species. But right now I think it's a little bit dormant in our culture, and we're up against a lot of different forces that need our attention. And the idea of collaborating again and crossing ideological or political or spiritual divides is really, really important so that we can face those collective problems together.
Tell us about your book.
Mm-hmm. So my book was started 12 years ago. I was studying in the Faculty of Education at McGill University. I was doing my PhD, and I interviewed dozens and dozens of social entrepreneurs to understand why they do the work that they do. So we know what an entrepreneur does, right? Sells products and services on the marketplace. Well, a social entrepreneur takes all the same tools from that toolbox, but instead of selling products, is actually interested in solving social and environmental problems. So I was interested in understanding why they do the work that they do. With all the talent they have, why are they working on a social environmental problem? And I was using narrative inquiry as my research methodology. I was trying to get into the lives of, from a young age, what kind of family do they grow up in? I was trying to see if there were any common themes. And there were two things that existed across this population without fail, without exception. One is that they had service behavior modeled in their home, which I think is an important message on a day like today.
Hold it. Explain that. What's service behavior and what's modeled in their home? So from their parents?
Yes. So just the idea of volunteering. So they saw their parents volunteer. They got brought, maybe back in the day, they felt they got dragged to a volunteer, to do some volunteer work, whether it was wrapping gifts at Christmas time or, making sandwiches in a soup kitchen. No matter what the expression of that service was, they saw it modeled in their home. So it became part of their value system and sort of their ethos about how they live their life, to be of service. And I have a lot more to say about that later if you want to ask me about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But so that was one thing that they all had in common. The second thing was that they saw a group of people disenfranchised somehow, marginalized somehow, in some circumstances that were just sort of unjust, and they felt empathy for that group. and they felt a compulsion, a need to act on that empathy. So they just couldn't turn a blind eye. And so what happened as a result of the research that I was doing is I developed a pedagogy of what I called empathic action. How do we teach young people to think about their lives as an expression of empathic action? What can they do to create positive change in the world? And so since I defended my dissertation in 2011, I've been ongoing research around the power of empathy. And I see it not only as a lever for social change, but I also see it as an important instrument and trait for us to have to improve our own personal relationships. And then, of course, in the last couple of years, what's really surfaced like nothing else before is the need for empathic leadership and empathic organizations. So the book is that wide of scope. It basically says, okay, let's learn a little bit about empathy. Let's learn about the neuroscience of empathy, which is actually quite exciting. And then let's talk about empathic leadership, empathic cultures. And then I kind of move into the superpowers, not the superpowers, but the superheroes of empathy, the people on the front lines that naturally engage in empathy on a regular basis, the therapists, the school teachers, the people in healthcare, humanitarians. I also talk about the small p political nature of empathy and the spiritual nature of empathy. So there's a lot of stories, inspiring stories about people who have, changed careers. They might be among those corporate refugees that said, why am I working so hard? I don't feel like my life has purpose or meaning. Isn't there something else that I could do? So there's lots of really, I think, inspiring stories in the book to help any reader, because we all know this, and I'll end with this, to remind ourselves that we can all turn up the volume of empathy in our lives. And if we do, everyone else benefits. The people who are on the receiving end of our empathy benefit, but then we also do as well. So it's sort of the ultimate win-win.
Fascinating. What's the title, and where can we buy it?
So it's called Purposeful Empathy: Tapping Our Hidden Superpower for Personal, Organizational, and Social Change. And you can buy it at any online retail that you like to shop at. And of course, hopefully at the retail stores that you walk by. Excellent.
We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes with Anita Nowak and chat a little bit more about empathy. And I'd love to touch on the neurological bases for empathy. I'd love to find out about whether it actually can exist in organizations, because that's I think a radical idea. And then also a little bit about social change that can come from empathy. Stay with us, everyone. I think this is going to be a really interesting conversation tonight. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I want to introduce you again to Anita Nowak, actually Dr. Anita Nowak. She is an empathy evangelist, an author of Purposeful Empathy, a podcaster, a keynote speaker. She currently is a lecturer at the University of McGill University in Montreal. She's been teaching at the Faculty of Management for the past decade, and am proud that she was awarded the Professor of the Year by the Management Undergraduate Society in 2014 and 2019. Her courses include social entrepreneurship and innovation, leadership, managing for impact, and social learning for social impact. And she's, as I mentioned just recently, authored and published a book, Purposeful Empathy, and it's available wherever you can get good books and online as well. You said that there was a neurological basis for empathy. That would be an interesting place to start. Can you explain that, please?
So the discovery of mirror neurons is actually quite interesting. There was a team of neuroscientists in Parma, Italy, that were working with macaque monkeys, and they had, these machines, these nodes hooked up to the brains of these macaque monkeys, and were trying to discern what parts of the brain were lighting up as they sort of had tactile functions, lifting things, moving things around. And by accident, this is not a joke, by accident, they forgot to close one of the machines when they were taking a lunch break. And one of the lab folks came back in and noticed that one of the monkeys was eating and another monkey in another cage was watching that monkey eating. And they noticed that the monkey that was observing the behavior of eating delicious food had its brain pleasure and reward centers light up as though he were eating the great food by himself. They thought that was just a coincidence. They replicated that, and then they did it with a whole bunch of other animals. And it turns out we as humans too have a mirror neuron system. So we know what it's like. Brian, I'm sure you and your listeners know what it's like. You watch somebody stub their toe and we wince, right? We have this kind of reaction. That's our mirror neuron system at play. We walk by and we see kids playing in the park and they're laughing. They're having a good, like, just, you know, the sweetness of children laughing. And we just sort of smile. We're like an emotional resonance. We just love seeing that expression of joy. And another example is when we're watching a horror movie, right? And we're like scared because the music is so eerie. If you turn down the volume of the music, all of a sudden the scene is less scary. That's also playing with our affective empathy. So our brains, our mirror neuron system is in resonance with other people's emotions, and that happens naturally to us. So that's one part of the neuroscience of empathy that's worth mentioning. The other thing that's worth mentioning is that we have what's known as brain plasticity, neural plasticity. So when we're born, we have had very few thoughts and very few lived experiences. So there are very, very few neural connections in our brain. So it's kind of like a wide open space, right? As we live through our first year of life, our second year and our third year of life, those early days, we have the most amount of thinking and processing of data because everything is new to us. And our neural connections get formed in those very formative years. And the more often we have exposure to certain experiences, the thicker our neural connections get. So the way I explain it is, if you are a child crossing a football field on a Monday morning to go to school, and it's just, had 10 centimeters of snow over the weekend, you're the kid who has to do the hard work. You have to slog your way across the football field. You're making the first set of tracks. Now, if a bunch of kids follow you that morning, they're going to follow in the footsteps and create a proper track right across the football field. That's how our neural system works as well. So if you're born into a family where there's lots of nurturing and kindness and loving and attention, if you cry, somebody picks you up and takes care of your needs, your neural connections will be formed differently than if you're brought into a family where there's a lot of stress and strife and neglect and abuse. And so I remember when I started learning about that I was like, oh, well, that's tragic because it's not the baby's fault or the child's fault if they're brought up into that environment. And that's going to maybe be predictive of how they're going to be as an adult. We all know from our own, experience that there are a lot of adults that are out there in the world very defensive, right? And you're not sure why they're defensive all the time. Well, I would conjure that they probably have something in their history and in their neural networks that has them react in such a defensive way all the time. So what's neat about our brains is that they're plastic. That's called plasticity, neuroplasticity. We can change the neural connections in our brains by thinking different thoughts and by acting in different ways. And the more you practice empathy, the more it becomes a natural way of being. I recall reading about this sort of, let's say in 2008, 2009, as I was working on my thesis, and I started a whole bunch of experiments. I remember going to the drive-through and I wanted to do some pay it forward. I wanted to experience sort of paying kindness forward and how that felt for me. So my budget was $5. I'd go through like a Tim Hortons drive-through and I'd pay for my order. And then I'd ask the cashier, I'd say, how much is the order behind me? And if it was anything under $5, I'd pay it forward. So I'd pay it forward. And I remember in the early days of trying this experiment, I'd drive away and I'd look in the rearview mirror till I caught the person who's at the counter getting the freebie. And I remember getting this little dopamine hit, like, oh, because they could wave at me or I would see them happy. And I realized that maybe I was not taking my own experiment to its full extent. So eventually I got to the point where I would pay it forward and just drive off and not feel the need to feel the payback of like, oh yeah, I did such a good deed. And it still gave me joy and pleasure. So I would practice that. And I started practicing all sorts of sort of empathic behaviors until it got to a point where I found myself in circumstances reacting and behaving differently. So I know this is a story I probably have shared once or twice before, but I'll share it again because I think, since this is being taped for Easter Monday, that maybe some people will relate. I remember being in a lineup at a FedEx store in Place Ville-Marie, a big office tower downtown Montreal. And it's long before mobile phones. So there was nothing to distract me. I was standing in line for like half an hour during the holiday season, waiting to send a package. Everybody was bored. Everybody was annoyed. I get to the counter and the woman who greets me is rude. And I don't mean just like a little bit rude. I mean like just mean, nasty, rude for no reason. And I was triggered. I was like, hey, yo, like, and I wanted to immediately call her on it. That was my initial reaction. Like, how dare you? And I just had a flash where I was like, okay, this could be a moment I could practice empathy. So I looked at her, I took a breath, and I said, are you okay? And it was just this earnest quality that she discerned. I wasn't being sarcastic. She burst straight into tears. She was crying. I reached out, I held her hands. She said, my son's at home sick with a fever. I think I'm getting sick. I've worked 2 double shifts for 2 weeks straight. It's 3 p.m. I haven't had a lunch break. I'm just exhausted. And that humanity that opened up for us in that moment, it's still like, I still have goosebumps talking about it. This happened a decade ago. I don't know her name, but I'll never forget what it was like to just offer an opportunity for empathy to show up. And so our brains can practice becoming more empathic, just like you go to the gym and you do bicep curls. We can become more empathic with practice. And I think if that became a popular idea and we started to do that, we could really change the world.
What a great story. Let me try to, peel this onion back a little bit if I could. So you're saying that there's a neurological basis for empathy, this mirror neuron, and lots of animals had it. I thought it was only a few animals, humans and primates or something like that. So maybe you could talk about that. And then second of all, some people wonder about whether empathy is something that we're born with or that we are socialized for. The first story you told about this neurological basis, the mirror neuron, suggests we're born with it. It's in our genes. The second story, both in your thesis and in your muscle analogy, suggests that we have to have a family that is empathetic and that we have to learn to be involved in society and show kindness from our families, and or we need to practice it in our daily lives and strengthen it over time. So what is it? Is it all animals have it, or are we unique? And are we born with it, or is it something that we're socialized over time to gain it?
Okay, so I'm going to come back to the animals last because I have something really wonderful to talk about. I'll say this: we are born with the capacity to empathize, and we can grow that capacity over our lifetime. There are developmental pathways and milestones that we hit, like at 3 months, for example. I remember as an empathy researcher, I was curious to see if this would live out. My daughter was 3 months old. We were out for a stroll. It was a sunny day. She was in a great mood, and we passed another woman coming the opposite direction, also with a stroller and a son sitting in it. And as we got closer, that little boy in her stroller was having a little fit, having a meltdown, like a crying meltdown. And my child, just as we passed, who was in a good mood, my little Annika, caught, discerned that this little boy was crying and burst spontaneously into tears herself. And, try not to judge me, but I thought that was wonderful because I saw it with my own eyes, that this was called emotional contagion, and it happens at around the 3-month mark. So there are different developmental milestones that we hit as humans in our development, but we can always become more empathic with practice. So even though it's true, depending on our circumstances, our empathy will be elevated or stunted, that doesn't mean that it's a predictor for how empathic you can be over your lifetime. So I find that very, very hopeful. Now, to answer the question about animals, I've never owned a dog. I grew up with a cat. My cat was very independent, but whenever, and there were 3 girls in the house, so we all went through our sort of teenage years together while Fluffy was still alive. Without a doubt, when we were crying over whatever was going on, our cat found us and cuddled with us and let us pet her. And dogs, I think, are full on expressions of empathy. They're always happy to see you. They always want to be around you. They boost your joy factor. That's why everybody loves dogs. I have had the recent experience of doing equine coaching, and I knew somewhere along the lines that horses had a healing quality to them, right? That a lot of, there are programs to help people with PTSD or who have are survivors of sexual assault in some way, that spending time with horses actually helps heal. What I didn't know is that horses have qualities where you can actually become a better leader. So I spent some time with this fabulous, fabulous woman in Morin Heights, north of Montreal, by the name of Anouk Laurie. She has a leadership and coaching center called Wasabi Coaching. And she has a number of horses that she adopts. They're about to be sort of put down, but she takes them on, knowing that there's more work than just sort of the race horsing that they were, or the work horses that they were. And apparently all horses on the planet have the same empathic quality. They are prey animals. They are not predator. So they are alert all the time to anything that might pose a risk to them. And they collaborate as a herd. They all have roles and they're always working together to flourish. Okay. They try to do this with the least amount of energy, but they all try to flourish. And it's an interesting, the more I learned about it from Anouk, the more she shared that, the herd quality of horses can be applied to organizations as well, right? So everybody has a role, everybody's contributing, minimize effort, maximize outcome. And I had the experience of doing some one-on-one coaching with a horse, and this horse's name was Pico. And she had me feel embodied when I felt shame, for example. I had this one experience in one of my classrooms where a student asked a question and I felt like shame. Sometimes we feel judged. Sometimes we're put on the spot and we feel this sense of, oh my gosh, how am I coming across? How is the person judging me? And in trigger culture, that's happening all the time. So I shared this experience, and I'm standing in a round pen with Pico, and the horse wanted nothing to do with me when I was feeling that shame. Then she had me talk about what it feels like when I'm in my classroom and the day is going well. I'm having a good conversation with my students. We're all engaged. We're all sort of like really at the edge of our seats talking about something important. And all of a sudden the horse came towards me, nudging into my arm, wanting to be around me. And then she said, okay, now tell me about all the emails in your inbox. Tell me about what's stressing you out. So I started talking about it. The horse would walk away. And then she said, okay, tell me about what it's like when you have a dance party in your living room with your daughter. And I would tell her about what it's like to dance, and the horse would be right next to me. So I had this somatic experience with a living creature that wanted to be near me when I was when I was feeling a sense of joy, a sense of expression, a sense of purpose, and didn't want to have anything to do with me when I was feeling anxious or judged. So I think animals have a capacity to empathize that might be different than ours, but they are very attuned to our emotional well-being.
Fascinating. You mentioned a term I haven't heard before, trigger culture. What is trigger culture?
Trigger culture. So the idea of being triggered is if, let's say, somebody, you're having an argument with somebody and they say something that touches a sensitive part to your life. Okay. So let's say you grew up and you grew up in a big family, you were the fourth kid, and you always felt like you got the scraps, the leftovers, the hand-me-downs, right? And so let's say you're having an argument and somehow your partner says something that triggers a memory of something that used to upset you when you were a kid, and you might not even be conscious of it. This all kind of works at the subconscious level. So we're triggered all the time. That's why all of our arguments kind of derail, because they're based on maybe subconscious triggers. But what's happening in our culture is that we're triggering each other left, right, and center on purpose. I'm no longer on Twitter. I was never a Twitter user, but I realized I just didn't like it because it just felt like such a toxic space where people were, anonymously saying mean things to each other, cutting each other down. And you feel triggered by those. You feel triggered because your identity is either questioned or your intelligence is questioned. So that's what trigger culture is.
So you're saying that we want to trigger people? We're trying to trigger people today?
There are a lot of people that are trigger happy. They want their whole ethos is to cut down other people. And these ad hominem attacks without actually reflecting on people's lives, like, people might say something in haste and then you attack them for, whatever their position is along ideological lines. So there's just this culture of just meanness happening, mean-spiritedness. And because it's anonymous, it gets even worse. And I think that's something that we have to mitigate against. Like, we have to really recognize that there are people on the receiving end of those comments that, also have challenges and doubts and losses, and that we just need to be kinder to one another.
So is this the opposite of empathy, or is it actually really intense empathy but used for a negative purpose?
That's a great question. I mean, mean-spiritedness is a lack of empathy for sure. And if you are intentional about touching somebody's trigger button, well, that does require some empathy. It requires cognitive empathy because you understand what will hurt them, but it doesn't have affective empathy, which is the quality of feeling what someone else is feeling, right? So
I interviewed this psychiatrist that I think that specializes in empathy in Oakville, and he said that manipulators are really very empathetic. They're just using their understanding of what impacts someone else for a negative purpose.
Yeah, Dr. Ashok Bhattacharya, for sure. He works with people who have narcissism, and he's able to help them overcome narcissistic tendencies by actually, turning up the dial of empathy. It's amazing.
Fascinating. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back, and I'm going to ask Anita to read us something from her book and tell us a little bit about what the book is trying to get across. Stay with us, everyone. We'll be back in 2 minutes with Anita Nowak. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Dr. Anita Nowak. She is a lecturer at McGill University in the Business School. She's an empathy evangelist and author of an interesting new book called Purposeful Empathy, Tapping Our Hidden Superpower for Personal, Organizational, and Social Change. Anita, you said you were going to read us something negative from the book and then something positive. Is that what you want to do?
I'd love that. Thank you, Brian, for giving me this opportunity. So yes, this is what I call our 911 moment. I'm reading from the intro of the book. Are you concerned about the direction the world is heading and that we're running out of time to get things right? Does anxiety about global geopolitics and the next election cycle keep you up at night? Has presenteeism invaded your workplace, abducted your colleagues and direct reports, and dragged down productivity, innovation, and engagement? Have you started to notice the common thread among racism, climate change, wealth inequality, mental illness, addiction, and loneliness? Are you beginning to connect the dots between the shitstorm happening out there and the one going on in here? If so, this book is for you. 7 issues require our urgent attention. 1, predatory capitalism has created abhorrent wealth inequality and is fundamentally at odds with planetary boundaries. It's hard to fathom, but of the top 100 global economic entities, 69 are now corporations. A system once celebrated for lifting all boats has become degenerate in its asymmetry. If we care about humanity and life on our planet, we must seek alternative economic approaches animated by a new set of values, including empathy. 2, our social fabric is in tatters, thanks to crippling polarization. A robust democracy always includes discord, but today's division run dangerously deep. In a zero-sum game, voters loathe their opponents, fomenting the potential for violence. And to avoid that outcome, we must exercise empathy to restore mutual respect and common ground. 3, our mental health is also under siege. 5 years ago, the world's first Minister of Loneliness was appointed by the United Kingdom. Now, in the aftermath of COVID and mass social distancing, the rates of chronic anxiety, addiction, depression, self-harm, mental illness, domestic violence, and suicide have risen everywhere. Despite our 24/7 digital connectivity, we are desperate for human connection and a sense of belonging, and we need more empathy to transcend the era of social isolation. Our ethos of materialism and consumerism, worsened by our addiction to social media and hollow celebrity culture, is making us more selfish, eroding our self-worth, and harming our mental health. We humans suffer without meaning in our lives. In response, we must turn inward to reflect deeply on our values and purpose and ignite a cultural renaissance of brotherly and sisterly love rooted in empathy. Our Western bias towards science, objectivity, and linear thinking is limiting our capacity to problem solve. Neuroscience has revealed that our brains have an analytical network for critical thinking and a social network for empathy and moral reasoning. To address our wicked problems, we must engage both sides of our brains holistically and embrace alternative ways of knowing. This includes tapping into embodied metaphysical and spiritual wisdom. Indigenous cultures have much to teach us in this regard. Society's dated model of leadership fails to grasp that our organizations are living systems. Most corporate leaders are hopelessly out of touch with their workforces, and the old stale male paradigm of command and control must be replaced by conscious leadership that's inclusive, generative, and empathic. Finally, sexism, systemic racism, and other forms of discrimination continue to run rampant. To be clear, misogyny and white supremacy harm women and people of color the most, but wherever oppression lives, so too does an insidious form of social cancer. Humans cannot flourish at the expense of one another. Only unjust systems make that so. We must decolonize our hearts and minds. That's why empathy, which unites us in our shared humanity, holds so much promise. I don't pretend to have solutions to the biggest problems we face today, but thanks to my research and a couple of decades doing impact work, here's what I know for sure. The world needs more empathy. Humans need empathy to thrive. Everyone is capable of empathy, and sustained, purposeful empathy can elevate our lives as we change the world. So that's it from the intro.
Wow. Didn't you say that you work at a business school?
I do.
How can you work at a business school with predatory capitalism as your number one and stale male high testosterone leadership as your number, what was it, 5 or 6?
I think the youngest generation, so 10 years ago, when I would complain about capitalism, I think the class reacted that the impression that they formed is, if I'm criticizing capitalism, I must be a communist. I must think that that capitalism is bad. I think the kind of capitalism that we're practicing now in late stage neoliberal capitalism has lost the plot. We are not respecting planetary boundaries. We are looking at short-term profit as the driver of business and not looking at stakeholders. The whole society, it used to be that companies had a social contract and they cared about their different constituent groups, their employees, their suppliers, the environment. It looks like all of that has gone way out the door to a large extent. And the younger generation that's facing the realities of climate change over the next 10, 20 years recognize that this has to be reconciled. We have to find limits on capitalism through policies, through taxation that actually will address the excesses that are throwing us off the cliff. So that's what I have to say about capitalism. And there's an appetite for that among the younger generation. They just get it intuitively. I remember towards the end of the book, I actually share a story. I was doing executive education at Harvard. Okay. So not a wallflower of capitalism at the Harvard Business School and exec ed. And one of the cases we were studying was Sesame Street. So you probably remember Sesame Street. We all grew up on Sesame Street. It's still out there in the world. Thank goodness. Sesame Street is a great public good. It taught literacy and numeracy to children who might not actually have gone to great schools and might not have had a family that did homework with them. So it was a great public good. And it was a non-for-profit. And it carried on for a long time doing great work. We all know Big Bird. We all know Snuffleupagus. We remember these creatures, right? They're part of our collective memory. At some point, when the advent of the internet came along and YouTube, they found themselves in a situation where their brand was no longer as popular, competing against all these other things. And what could they do to stay alive? They were also, no longer had enough funds to keep themselves afloat. So there was a decision to find sort of some kind of hybrid for-profit partnerships with different companies. And so part of the case was how it went from this great brand under, some external competitive forces, and how it re-emerged as a successful organization. And all I remember thinking is, through the conversations of like, what happened to the organization that it kind of floundered? Well, that it got, it took itself for granted. They thought they were such a great organization that they didn't need to keep up with the times. A whole host of reasons, including just complacency that this is the way we do things around here. We don't need to upset what's working. And I just kept thinking, okay, it's great that they succeeded and that they found those partners, but we collectively in 2023 are living as if we're on autopilot, with complacency that the way things are going right now in terms of how businesses are organized and how society is organized, without recognizing that we need to adapt and change given the circumstances. And there's not enough incentives, even though we intuitively know something's wrong, something is wrong. We're working too hard. We're killing our biodiversity on the planet. Our mental health is under siege under the circumstances. We have to change things. We're not doing it fast enough. So in the business school where I'm teaching future leaders, the conversation is, what can we do? How can we bring our talents and agency to the conversation with people that have power and influence, and say, how are we going to make this change together?
There are numerous organizations, conscious capitalism and things like that have been trying to address some of the concerns that you identify. I went to Harvard. I got my MBA there. I came from a Liberal Party political spectrum in Canada. Let me tell you, my Liberal friends thought of me as a blue Liberal or red Tory at best. At Harvard, I was deemed a communist in some of my political attitudes. So I understand sort of the environment that you were in because I experienced it. That said, right now, and there was an editorial in the Toronto Star just this past weekend about how companies have to be more mindful of employees that want to stay in a hybrid scenario and want to have more flexible work hours and want to have more time at home, et cetera. But yet, most companies, most CEOs are demanding that people come back to work. We seem with politics to have split. And a sizable part of our political spectrum support very authoritarian populist leaders that just sort of don't have a lot of empathy and tell us, what we should be doing. Do you really think that there is demand for this empathetic leadership that you describe? Or is it just a left-wing, radical, small minority idea?
Mm-hmm. So I think I'll answer the question talking about business and talking about policy in two ways. I think the populist, strongman politician is using cognitive empathy in a very, very astute way. And that is to prey on the fear of people. So people are feeling pain based on, companies offshoring and, these usine factories closing in the Midwest. People are feeling like they don't recognize culture because there's just been a change in the plurality of society, right? So it's very kind of, as humans, the first part of the brain that was actually created is the amygdala, okay? And the most recent part of the brain that evolved is the neocortex, which uses reasoning. The amygdala is the fight or flight part of the brain. When we are faced with a threat, our amygdala fires and it says, okay, protect yourself. So populist strongmen politicians are using scapegoats to fire up our amygdala and say, oh my gosh, I'm under threat. These things are happening, and those are the people responsible. So I think the politics of empathy there is to kind of come back to our neocortex and say, let's really think this through, right? I've traveled to 65 countries. There's not one place on the planet that I have been where people do not care about their families and their families' well-beings. We have more in common than what divides us. And so I think when it comes to politics, we need to lean intentionally into more empathy for others and not be beholden to our old fears that freak us out. And shame on those politicians that egg on those fears. When it comes to the workplace, there are some organizations and some sectors where command and control is the ethos. Like the US military can't be more empathic from the point of view of delivering on their mission, because their mission is to, fight the good cause and defend the interests of the nation that you're representing. So I'm not so naive to say that empathy and empathic leadership should just be like swept across every organization all the time. But I do think that there is a need to recognize that human beings are walking through your offices. Human beings are at their computers doing the work, and to engage them simply as employees with the function or the role or the responsibilities that they have that sort of matter to your business's bottom line is missing a great opportunity. I share an example. You give me a chance, Brian, to do this?
Yep.
A little example? Okay. So I mentioned earlier, or I should mention, that our brains can't be in a state of empathy and in a state of anxiety simultaneously. Okay. Our brain cannot do both. So imagine you're a manager, you're sitting at your computer and you have great plans for the weekend with your family, but all of a sudden you get an email saying like some client thing went sideways and now we have to all come together. There'll be a huddle. Throws your weekend plans out the door. So you're upset. You're really upset getting this email. And at the same time, there's a knock on your door. Tuck, tuck, tuck. One of your star employees comes in, takes a seat, says, do you have a minute? You're like, yes. But you're still focused on what's going on for the weekend. Your plans have been botched. But your star employee says to you, I need a week off because my partner just had a miscarriage. Or I just lost my parent, or something going on, okay, big in their life. So as a manager, okay, you got to put away your own email and your own stuff to be present for your employee because your employees just shared something tough. How do you do that? So if you're going to be an empathic leader, you have to, first of all, have some self-awareness about how you're feeling in the moment and have some self-regulation. Maybe just taking a few deep breaths to sort of calm down your parasympathetic nerve system so that you can then shift gears and you're not locked into sort of your own anxiety, your own thoughts. And now you open up a possibility to be empathic, to hold the space for your employee, to share what's on their mind. Now, of course, another thing that comes to your mind is, okay, well, if your employee's off for a week, what does that mean about project XYZ? We have to find a solution. Maybe now, in the moment when they're talking to you about this really emotionally laden issue, is not the time to problem solve. So you listen, you hold the space for them. You tell them that's really tough. You don't make it about you at all. You don't make it about your team, your organization. You say, let's go for a walk outside. Thank you for confiding in me. That must be hard what you're going through. And then at a later stage, come back to them and say, okay, well, now what? If you're off for a week, how are we going to redeploy, the work or redistribute the work so that all the work gets done? That's taking empathic action. I think that kind of empathic leadership is a skill that can be developed and everybody benefits. There's a stat that I came across where it's 87% of CEOs know that if there was more empathy in the workplace, that the workplace culture would benefit. And still 1 out of 5 are willing to show more empathy. The other 4 out of 5 fear that if they showed empathy, that they would actually be seen as lesser leaders. That is a myth that needs to be debunked.
Well, and then Mad Men had that famous scene where the employee comes in and asks for some recognition and some empathy, and the answer retorted back is, "I pay you."
Yeah.
That's why
wasn't that in the 50s that show existed?
I think you're right. We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments in just a minute. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight, Easter Monday, with Anita Nowak, Dr. Anita Nowak from McGill University, about a book she's just published called Purposeful Empathy, Tapping Our Hidden Superpower for Personal, Organizational, and Social Change. Anita, you read us a segment from your intro that was reasonably negative, and I think listed 5 or 6, real issues that we've got in our society today. And frankly, I agree with all of them, and I think that we need to address them. Have you got something more positive, though, that you can leave us with? Please.
Brian, thank you for letting me do that. I'm going to read from the conclusion now of Purposeful Empathy. 2021 marked the 10th anniversary of the World Happiness Report, which summarized how 9 million people in more than 150 countries around the world evaluated their own lives. After 2 years of COVID, what became clear is the extent to which both benevolence and trust contributed to well-being during the pandemic. John Helliwell, a professor at the University of British Columbia and co-author of the report, said, "We found during 2021 remarkable worldwide growth in all 3 acts of kindness monitored by the Gallup World Poll. Helping strangers, volunteering, and donations were strongly up in every part of the world, reaching levels almost 25% above their pre-pandemic prevalence. This surge of benevolence, which was especially great for the helping of strangers, provides powerful evidence that people respond to others in need, creating in process more happiness for the beneficiaries, good examples for others to follow, and better lives for themselves." Unquote. Evidence of purposeful empathy may be the silver lining of the pandemic, with important lessons we must integrate, especially in the face of climate change. The good news is that for as long as we Homo sapiens have been alive, empathy has been our saving grace. Now it's time for us to revitalize that legacy. And I end with 2 quotes. The first by L.R. Nost. "Do not be dismayed by the brokenness of the world. All things break and all things can be mended, not with time, as they say, but with intention. So go, love intentionally, extravagantly, unconditionally. The broken world waits in the darkness for the lightness that is you." And Arundhati Roy says, "Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing."
Love unconditionally and extravagantly. What does that say to you?
We are meant to be kinder, Brian. We are meant to be kinder to ourselves, kinder to our friends and family, and kinder to strangers. It's the teachings of Ramadan, of Passover, of Easter. All the great faiths in the world will say the same thing about the golden rule. Lean into purposeful empathy and see what happens to your life.
The golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It is interesting. We chatted before we started today that Passover, Ramadan, and Easter only come at the same time 3 times a century, every 33 years. But this is the 2nd year in a row that they've come together, and it won't come again for another 32 years. And so I think that you're right, that is something that we should be thinking about. And I love your love extravagantly and love unconditionally. And whether that's from 1 Corinthians or whether it's a brand new quote that you've just manufactured and read to us today, I think it's wonderful. And I love the idea, Anita, of purposeful empathy. This other gentleman, this other psychiatrist that I talked about said that empathy was important, but empathy put to work is kindness. And I think that that's what your purposeful empathy is all about. And I think that we've got to find reasons to be empathetic and to put positive empathy to work. And so I really appreciate you sharing that with us. And I'm looking forward to delving into your book and reading more of it. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me, Brian. I really appreciated this opportunity.
That's our show for tonight. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from Montreal, at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videocasts are available on my website, briancrombie.com. Videos are on YouTube and Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn, and my podcasts. I get 5,000 people a night, supposedly, based on the statistics that are listening to my podcasts. So that's pretty good, and 20,000 people on my radio. So I really appreciate the opportunity to share Dr. Anita Nowak's ideas on empathy, because I do think they can change the world. And I really appreciate you sharing us the book and your thoughts in the book with us all. Good night, everybody.